Welcome every one of you to a PRA policy webinar responding to the TRIPS waiver, Global Voices of Intellectual Property Right Innovation Access to Vaccine. This webinar will be organized in two parts. The first part, we will have a representative from US, Canada, Brazil, and providing legislative and political update about IP waiver, while in the second part, we will have a policy expert providing insight about analysis. Unfortunately, member of European Parliament, Mandl, will not be able to join us today for important commitment. I'm Lorenzo Montanari, Executive Director of Property Right Alliance, a research and advocacy group based in Washington, D.C., founded in 2005 and in charge of publishing two international indexes. International Property Right Index since 2007 and Trade Barrier Index since 2019. PRA stands as an advocacy group dedicated to the protection of intellectual property right, physical property right, innovation, and free trade around the world. On the international stage, PRA works closely with the famed property right world champion Hernando de Soto. Thanks to the special relationship with Hernando de Soto, each year with our economist, Professor Sara Levi-Carsiente, we produce and publish the International Property Right Index. This index is the flagship publication of PRA. It is the world only index entirely dedicated to the measurement of intellectual property right and physical property right. The last edition of IPRI, released in 2020, covers 120 countries, 98% of the world gross domestic product, and 93% of the world population. PRA developed around this index a network of more than 120 think tanks covering more than 70 countries. In our index, USA is leading the world in terms of IP protections. While in 2018, PRA proudly released its first edition of International Trade Barrier Index, a report created and authored by our colleague, Philip Thompson. So why IP are crucial for innovation and to fight COVID-19? It is more than 1 year since the World Health Organization declared the COVID-19 outbreak a global pandemic, a health crisis that has seriously affected human life and global economy. Since then, the global economic growth dropped by almost 4% due to lockdowns. Nevertheless, in record times, scientists have pioneered new vaccine. In fact, more than 3.65 billion vaccine doses have been administered worldwide, equal to 48 doses for every 100 people. On average, pharmaceutical company and some countries like USA and Germany invested 300 million to discover new mRNA vaccine without the guarantee of success. Today, in the US, about 161 million of Americans have been fully vaccinated. This means more than 49% of the population. According to the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, on average, it takes 12 years from the discovery phases to market approval, with an average cost of 2.6 billion. Less than 12% obtain the approval and enter in the market. IP rights are the only guarantee for innovators to own the know-how and the knowledge and to recoup R&D cost and invest in new next generation of medicine. This is the region that an IP waiver supported by US, South Africa, and India will be detrimental for innovation and to protect us for future pandemic. Before starting the first section, I want to invite now my colleague Philip Thompson for a small introduction on TRIPS waiver. Philip, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and thank you to all our distinguished guests for joining us today at this to discuss this important topic on the role of intellectual property rights, innovation, and access to vaccines. As we get started, I want to set the scene by describing a little bit about what the TRIPS agreement is, what the TRIPS waiver is, and a little bit about where we are on vaccines production and uptake. So TRIPS stands for Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. It's been called a watershed agreement for many reasons. Before TRIPS, most trade rules focused on telling countries what not to do. Don't violate national treatment or most favored nation principles. Don't create burdensome rules that restrict imports. But TRIPS requires countries to do something. That's to protect intellectual property rights. Previous global trade rules left that as optional. Today, TRIPS serves as the global enforceable minimum standard for protecting intellectual property rights around the world. It has also opened the door for other trade-related topics to be part of the global trade discussion, like enforcing labor standards or setting environmental rules. It's especially relevant to know that the United States spearheaded efforts to include IP in the Uruguay round of negotiations that led to the formation of the WTO. It was also the first trade regime that had a dispute resolution system. But in that negotiations, its USTR ambassador Uter declared that if intellectual property along with services and agriculture weren't included and investment weren't included in the agreement, the US would not participate to help form the WTO. Over the next 7 years of those negotiations, the United States played a pivotal role in establishing the need and principles of global intellectual property protection, which ultimately became the TRIPS agreement and part of the WTO. Fast forward to March 2020, the WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic. Everyone from teachers, doctors, nurses, grocery store workers leaned into the mission to adapt in any way possible to protect the public to fight the virus. For pharmaceutical companies, that meant launching hundreds of clinical trials to test the efficacy of already developed vaccines and therapeutics, and also launching trials for novel new technologies that might stand a chance. And the US Operation Warp Speed played a pivotal role in making sure not yet approved doses would be ready to reach as many people as possible in the shortest amount of time. In less than a year, millions of doses of several highly effective vaccines backed by decades of R&D were beginning to be injected into the arms of frontline workers and the elderly. Today, 3.64 billion doses have been administered in 179 countries. At the same time as the pandemic was declared, quite a few countries, in anticipation, passed legislation to ease the process of manufacturing pharmaceuticals under a compulsory license regime. This is one of the many TRIPS flexibilities included in the agreement, but domestic legislation is usually needed to begin the process. The WHO also created a voluntary patent pool. Fortunately, no country has yet found cause to issue compulsory licenses for anything related to COVID-19. However, India and South Africa initiated a petition that has gained support around the world and brings us to where we are today. The petition calls for a wide swath of intellectual property protections to be waived or suspended, not just patents, but other forms of intellectual property, and not just for vaccines, but for medical equipment and other technology. And a sweeping move, the United States declared it would entertain such negotiations after it postponed having a position for the previous 5 months. Unfortunately, it appears the US may believe that patents somehow are a barrier to vaccine production, which has not been demonstrated in the real world. The waiver itself does not state that patents or other forms of IP are actually barriers to access vaccines, only that they could be. However, the next proposal expanded the scope of the waiver to include materials or components, as well as their methods and means of manufacturing, and it failed to limit it to a certain time period. In short, it appears unnegotiable for the proposal that the United States suggested it would negotiate. And in its wake, the European Union also put forward its own proposal that addressed export restrictions, expanding vaccine protection, and streamlining existing TRIPS flexibilities. We anticipate that the United States is continuing to negotiate to find a consensus that has not yet presented itself to waive certain aspects of IP rights. I look forward to the comments by the other policymakers we have here today about how they view a waiver and the unintended consequences that might be lurking beneath it. Thank you so much, Lorenzo.
Thank you so much, Philip, for the introduction of the TRIPS waves. We are now moving to the first section of this webinar. I'm very pleased and we are honored to have Senator John Barrasso from us. Senator Barrasso was elected in 2018, re-elected in 2018, the US Senate with more than 67% of the vote. He's the third ranking member in the Senate Republican leadership as a chairman of the Senate Republican Conference. Senator Barrasso, thank you so much for your leadership and for your time. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much, Lorenzo, for the introduction, and thank you for moderating today's discussion. I note on the bookshelf behind you, you have a copy of Grover Norquist's book, Leave Us Alone. And I have that same book proudly displayed on the bookshelf in my office because I think it says a lot, and it could be the title and the brand for everything we're talking about here. Leave us alone. So I want to thank all the other speakers who are here from Austria, from Canada, from Brazil. We're here because we believe in protecting the ideas and the inventions of our innovators. In the United States, government has protected intellectual property from the very beginning. Article 1 of the Constitution explicitly gives Congress the power to promote the progress of science and the useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So our founding fathers knew that science needs protections in order to flourish. So thanks to the foresight of our founders, America has been home to some of the world's greatest scientists and inventors ever since. From Menlo Park to Kitty Hawk to Silicon Valley, America has always been the land where people dream big. Today, the United States continues to lead the world in research and in development. We lead the way in terms of investment. We lead the way in terms of achievement. If we hope to lead in the future, then we must carry on the founders' tradition of protecting ideas. That's why I was more than disappointed by President Biden's decision to give away the property rights of American companies when it comes to the coronavirus vaccines. This is yet another example of President Biden's marching to the tune of the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization. We know who's paying their way of playing that tune. Communist China. It's Russia. American businesses constantly struggle with China stealing our trade secrets. Robust IP protections have been a cornerstone of every trade deal negotiated by the United States. Yet President Biden just offered up American intellectual property on a silver platter. His decision violated the rule of law. It completely gutted intellectual property rights for companies who delivered safe, effective vaccines to the whole world when we needed them the most. Waiving American intellectual property protections for vaccines doesn't enhance global vaccine delivery. The countries who are receiving the free technology are going to have, I believe, a very difficult time manufacturing the vaccine. Making a vaccine that is complicated is not like making M&Ms. It's a complicated process. It requires specific equipment. It requires well-trained people, and it requires raw materials. Simply waiving patent protections does nothing in the near term to increase vaccine production. In fact, waiving these protections could actually, I believe, make it more difficult to manufacture COVID vaccines because more companies are going to be seeking the raw materials needed to manufacture vaccines. Raw materials are limited. If the vaccines aren't manufactured correctly, raw materials could be wasted. You know, the best way to get more vaccines to people around the world is to expand existing production capacity at home. Yet President Biden is doing just the opposite. My message to President Biden is, let's make more vaccines and let's make them where we know the vaccine will be made safely and correctly. Giving away our intellectual property isn't the answer. To me, as a doctor, Operation Warp Speed was a medical miracle. Until just a few months ago, the fastest vaccine development in history was the vaccine for mumps, and it took about 4 years. Vaccine development can take 10 to 12 years or even longer. Some efforts to make vaccines have never been successful in something like HIV/AIDS. Yet the United States granted emergency use authorization for 3 safe and effective coronavirus vaccines in less than a year. This is a historic achievement. Yet we should also acknowledge our scientists had a running start. The messenger RNA technology used by both Pfizer and Moderna had been in development for over 15 years. This research and development is extremely costly, and of course, it's time-consuming. That's why the real damage of President Biden's decision could still be into the future. President Biden has set a dangerous precedent. He caved to a request from India and South Africa. Other countries know it. We can expect a lot more requests for TRIPS waivers from President Biden in the future. Other countries have every reason to expect he will cave yet again. And the bigger problem with the president's decision was his rationale. The president justified his decision because he said coronavirus is a crisis. President Biden has also referred to a lot of other things as crises. He has called climate change the existential crisis, he says, of our time. Well, by the logic of his decision on vaccines, President Biden could justify giving away our clean energy technology. This is just flat wrong. We ought to encourage more research and development. We ought to encourage more investment in American businesses and workers and ideas. The best way to encourage it is by protecting intellectual property, not giving it away. The vast majority of research and development is not done by the government. It takes place in the private sector. Businesses invest in technology innovation because they see a market for them. This market only exists because we have laws to protect their intellectual property. And so to Lorenzo and to all of our presenters from around the world, thank you all for your efforts to protect the property rights of our innovators. These efforts are promoting the progress of science and innovation in America and around the world. Robust protections for intellectual property will help prepare the way for more medical miracles in the future. These protections benefit us all. With that, I'll turn this back over to Lorenzo.
Thank you so much, Senator Barrasso, for your very inspiring presentation. It is true, overriding patent protection is a dilemma that emerges every time there is a health pandemic. This dilemma is an endless ideological debate driven more by countries that believe in a free rider and anti-market ideology rather than a real innovation based on patent protection. So I know that you have a very, very busy agenda, so I will ask you a question and after before you leave. So what the international free market movement plus all the center-right parties should do to work together to contrast this anti-market ideology? I think as a PRA, we have been running international coalition letter. Recently, we did a letter for the World IP Day, April 26. We collect more than 100 signatures representing think tanks all over the world. So what should we do and how can we work more together in terms of a think tank movement and also center-right party?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. It is the Leave Us Alone, the book that you have behind you on the shelf. It is that approach to say people work very hard. They come up with ideas. They invest their time. They invest their money. And we need to make sure that that continues to be protected or that the incentive to do it may go away. That's the best way you can make progress. It's the way we made progress around the world. It's to me, the benefits of all of the Constitution of the United States, the way that we deal with ideas and people working to come up with improvements and inventions and patents, all of those things, that needs to be protected. The more we can do to share that message and make sure people around the world respect and understand that message, I think the better it's going to be long-term in progress for the world.
Thank you so much, Senator Barrasso. Thank you for your leadership in the Senate and looking forward to work with you in the future. Thank you again. Thank you so much. And when we're moving now, we have a great pleasure to have a member of the Canadian Parliament, Randy Hoback, is a member of the Conservative Party. He's elected in the Canadian Parliament since 2008, and he's a member of the Special Committee on the Economic Relationship between Canada and the United States. Representative Hoback, thank you so much for your time and again for your leadership on these issues. The floor is yours.
Good morning, Lorenzo. Thank you. It's great to be here. Nice here in Saskatchewan in my garage, as we all get used to Zoom and different types of platforms to do our presentations and talk to people around the world. So we'll take advantage of that here today and talk about intellectual property and the TRIPS waiver in particular. This last spring, the Canadian Trade Committee actually went into studies on the TRIPS waiver, and we actually brought in witnesses from around the world talking about the TRIPS waiver and the pros and cons to it. And the conclusions came from it basically is this wasn't the problem. So I think the first thing I want to say is everybody agrees we want to make sure that everybody gets the vaccine in an equitable and a timely manner. We want to make sure that they get the protection they require to safely proceed and go on with their lives. There's no question about that. And there's different ways of doing that. And I think that's where we differ, is we differ in how to get there. The simplistic approach is the TRIPS waiver. You know, you say, oh, wait a minute, it worked for AIDS vaccines, it worked for in the past for other things, so we can do that, and we'll vaccinate more people quicker. But when we got into the actual nuts and bolts of mRNAs, the actual hurdles that were sitting in front of us in regards to getting people their vaccines, TRIPS waiver wasn't the answer. It wasn't the only solution. There was lots more to the equation that needed to be solved. And I think that became very clear when we started talking about the process and mRNAs and what is required to actually produce those. So the TRIPS waiver, it sounds good. It's a media bite. People say, well, hey, we're going to sign on to the TRIPS waiver, and then all of a sudden they can forget about it. But did it actually, or would it actually accomplish the goal of vaccinating more people? That's the question that needs to be asked by everybody around the world. Is this the actual cure-all? Or is there other things that we should be doing in its place that would actually protect intellectual property, encourage companies to keep reinvesting in research and development, making sure that if we require booster shots, that companies actually want to produce that booster shot? Is there different ways to increase our manufacturing capacity? Those seem to be more of a real question that have to come into play here when we look at the TRIPS waiver itself. So in regards to myself personally, I'm against the TRIPS waiver. I think that is not the right way to go. I think it creates all sorts of disincentives for companies to invest in the future in research and development. And it actually, in the long term, makes things worse. So you might have short-term gain at long-term pain. And that's the problem that I see in the road or the path that we're going down on right now. Now, I must say, I was shocked when President Biden said, well, we're going to go down this path. I'm not shocked to see the EU and countries like Australia saying, no, this isn't the right way, and actually propose something different. Because like I said at the start, we all want to see people get vaccinated. We want to make sure that they get it in a timely and equitable manner. We want them to protect themselves and their families. We want to see our economies go back to normal. So let's look at some of the other things that are real barriers to to actually doing that. Because that's the goal at the end of the day, is actually getting jabs and arms. Lack of scaled up technology and sufficient manufacturing facilities. That was very clear. And it's very clear here in Canada and very clear in other parts of the world. We needed to figure out how to scale up the existing manufacturing facilities and actually put incentives in place for companies to put more manufacturing facilities and maybe more strategically around the world where they're located. That's something that governments can do right now. That's something that we could do working hand in hand together, saying, okay, what do we acquire? How do we help these different companies get to that level of production capacity? And then how do we put together a logistic network to actually get those vaccines out and about and get them into jabs, into people's arms? The other issue is lack of highly skilled trained workers to populate scaled up manufacturing facilities. So you need not just a new facility, you need to actually train people to operate and run those facilities. So where's the educational system? Where is government actually working together to say, okay, let's put together a program to make sure we have these skilled employees. Let's make sure that we've got the training in place to make sure that as new facilities come online or as we expand existing facilities, we actually have the bodies to work in them to actually do the product, to make the product that is required. So those are some of the things, one of the things that needs to happen. Regulatory, you need the proper oversight. You do. There's no question around it. So as you're producing those vaccines, you have to make sure you have the proper regulatory environment in place to make sure that vaccine's made according to the, I'm not sure what the proper word, prescription, for lack of a better word, ingredients, to make sure it's made in a manner that's safe for everybody to use and efficient and effective. So those are the things that have to go along with trying to increase our capacity to get more jabs in people's arms. And I think the big thing that people seem to forget about is the free flow of supply lines. Get rid of the trade restrictions. Countries have put in trade restrictions restricting the exportation of those vaccines. And I understand the single-mindedness of that, is saying, okay, we've got to take care of our own first. I get that, and the political pressures that come with that. But, as we look at expanding our facilities, and I'll use Canada, for example, if we're looking at putting facilities here in Canada, we shouldn't be just looking for the Canadian population. We should be looking for Canadian population plus. So, if countries really want to get serious in vaccinating people, they should actually start putting accountability in place to make sure that people do get vaccinated. So countries should actually be able to say, you know what, we signed on the TRIPS waiver, we're done, we did our thing. No, you haven't done your thing. If you've got manufacturing capabilities in your country and you've got the technology and you've got the educational system to put the people in place, you should commit to saying, you know what, we're going to take on 10 companies, 10 countries, 15 countries. And we're actually going to make sure those countries are vaccinated. And if we were to divvy that up around the world, all of a sudden you do have a scenario where all of a sudden you're actually benchmarking and looking for results and seeing how effective you are in getting vaccines around the world. By hiding it behind one organization, a lot of countries can just shy away and not really do anything. That's not acceptable in this day and age. The other thing that really concerns me, and the senator talked about this a little bit, is then the intellectual property in China. We've seen so much technology stolen out of Canada, go on to China. We've seen our universities basically funded by Chinese research, and then all that taken back to China. That has to stop. We cannot be the breeding ground for new ideas and new technologies just to have another country steal them and then put them out in the world market. It's not acceptable. And that needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be dealt with certainly and soon. And I can understand why a country like China would love to see this go forward, because they get access to mRNAs, to get access to the production facilities, and they can try to reverse and engineer it, and away they go. But an mRNA is not easy to reverse engineer. So if you open up the whole intellectual property side of things, it takes a lot of work off their loads in trying to copy it. And let's call a spade a spade. That's what they've done. And we've seen it over and over again, and it needs to stop. So I think when you start looking at the TRIPS waiver, you say, well, what is the goal at the end of the day? The goal at the end of the day is get jabs in people's arms. The goal at the end of the day is to get people vaccinated so they and their families are safe, our economies return to normal. And I always say this, there's always a conservative solution to any problem. There's always a free market solution to any problem. The easiest answer a lot of times is a socialist solution, but not an effective solution. So when we look at this solution and vaccinations, I think there's a free market solution to it. And I think there's a better way to do this that'll be more efficient, more effective, and get the results faster than trying to go down the path of a TRIPS waiver. Let's face it, TRIPS waiver right now, they're going to text to dialogue or dialogue or text in negotiating it. What, another 6 months? We know how the WTO works. It's not a fast-moving mechanism. It's very, very slow and cumbersome and bureaucratic. The private sector can move very fast if given the right signals to do just that. And I think that's what countries need to do, is show those signals, put them in place, and let those companies go out and do what they need to do. So thank you today. It's great to be here with you all this morning, and I look forward to questions in the future.
Thank you so much, Representative Hoback. We will have a Q&A question at the end of our webinar. So now we are moving to Secretary of Competition Advocacy, Geanluca Lorenzon. Is working in the Ministry of Economy in Brazil. Is one of the young free market leader in Brazil. Used to work as a CFO for Mises Institute, Accenture, and also, let me say, we also used to run the coalition meeting in Sao Paulo when he was working at think tank environment. So it's a great to see Geanluca Lorenzon now working as Secretary of Competition and Innovation in Brazil. Geanluca, thank you for joining us today for your leadership on innovation in Brazil.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here discussing with everyone, basically from around the world, with Senator Barrasso, with the MP Hoback, and everyone that is watching us. Is very, very nice for us. So Brazil is not known historically for being one of the greatest supporters of intellectual property rights. But I'm here to tell you today that this has changed in this government. It's not because we have finally a Chicago Minister of Finance and Economy here, but because we have serious economists, we have serious technical team in the government, and now Brazil has changed, and we are changing, and we are moving to be a serious country when in regards to this and other initiatives in the global commerce environment. So I'm just very, very happy to have this opportunity to join with different countries such as the United States, Canada, Austria, Italy, and so on. It's really important for us to present the new approach that Brazil have towards intellectual property rights. So first of all, let me start saying that how this was a breakthrough for Brazil not to join South Africa and India at the World Trade Organization to support the waiver. Because you see, Brazil, such as other emerging countries, have this political pressure to always see the, let's say, the industrial development of developed countries, such as the United States and so on, as like some sort of threat, as some sort of privilege that we should see politically as taking advantage of poor countries and so on. You guys know the ideological war, and let me assure you that in South America, it's hugely unpopular to support international markets. to support this kind of institutions. But overall, Brazil took a firm instance of being against it at the World Trade Organization, and we have been doing this, and this has not been an isolated action. Since this government started back in 2019, we as a government have made sure to change the strategy and change our position in every topic of intellectual property rights. We have adopted a national strategy that until 2023, which is the end of this strategy, we'll be completing over 50 actions to make Brazil more aligned with the international scenario. We signed back in 2019 and ratified by Congress the Madrid Agreement, the Madrid Protocol to join the recognition of intellectual property around the world. We have cut the backlog of Brazil's intellectual property register system by 60%. Brazil has the largest backlog system in the world for registering intellectual property, and we intend to get it to zero until next year. So we're very excited about it. We're cutting bureaucracy for you to have an idea of how bureaucratic Brazil is towards those issues. Brazil is the only country in which the registering of intellectual property must go through the Brazilian equivalent of the CDC, the health department, the autonomous agency. So that will take 2 to 4 years more of a process of registering intellectual property in Brazil related to health issues. So we're cutting red tapes. We are joining international standards, and we're making sure that Brazil has a new perspective on respecting, on enforcing, and on guaranteeing intellectual property rights. We have an unprecedented action against piracy and specifically East Asian imports in Brazil that have long disrespected, in some cases, intellectual property rights. And we are moving forward with this, even though, as you may know, Brazil is in the middle of economic crisis since 2015. We have a very limited budget because we believe in extreme fiscal control. It's important for an emerging country to have fiscal control over its budget. Otherwise, we're much more sensitive to inflation and so on. So Brazil, even though with all those limitations, with all those oppositions that come from having a right-wing government that Brazil hasn't had in decades, it was a victim and a hostage to social democracy and socialism for so long. Even though the unpopularity of such actions, we stand firm for intellectual property rights. And let me just agree with the diagnosis presented by Mr. Hoback from Canada. We are absolutely in favor of understanding that the main issue here when we're talking about COVID vaccines, and this is so important because Brazil has been one of the hotspots of COVID. We have been subject to one of the largest number of cases and unfortunately deaths in the world. So this also contributes to actions to support the waiving of intellectual property or even some more drastic action that the Congress of Brazil may or may not try to pass into law to force the federal government to take action on it. But we are on the same page when we understand that the problem here is that it's not a question of intellectual property rights, because some of the vaccines that we have in here, like AstraZeneca, that we have greatly been using, we have those rights. So the question here is the IFA is the active ingredient for the vaccines. We have to focus on helping both India, which is one of the main sourcing of those materials, on scaling production, being able maybe to produce them here. We have this plan for the next couple of months So this is our focus right now. It's to get those materials, and that's the main issue for us. We understand that that's what's gonna help to accelerate vaccination, which for us is so important. As you know, Brazil still it's above world average in vaccinations. We are the emerging country that has most vaccinated its population. I believe we are third or fourth in the world in absolute values, but still we need more. We still have about 1,000 daily deaths in Brazil. But for us, the question, it's non-intellectual property rights. I had the opportunity in a hearing in Congress to say, there's not one single industry in Brazil that could produce those if we waive those intellectual property rights. If one comes to us, but not a single industry came to the federal government and say, if we waive the intellectual property rights, we'll be able to start producing this very quickly. It's impossible. And I think that everybody knows that. So a lot of times this becomes let's say a more political and ideologue action, but Brazil continues to be firmly for intellectual property rights. We want to be part of the top tier in the world in business environment and the ease of doing business and the respect of international trade agreements. So it's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you again, Lorenzo, for this opportunity, and thank you for everyone watching. I mean, this is truly an opportunity for us to get together to face those different threats to intellectual property rights.
Thank you so much, Geanluca. It's really encouraging to listen to what you just said on behalf of the Brazilian government. I think Brazil is an important economic player, so having Brazil from inside the pro-IP bloc, let me call it this way, is very encouraging. And this is bring a lot of hope for our fight pro-IP against the TRIPS waiver. Now we're going to move to the second part, more focus on policy and analysis. And we have with us Emily Jaisman, is a trade policy advisor for the European Popular Party. She's worked also at the European Parliament, of course, and she's gonna provide an update from the European Union and also also from Germany. Thank you so much, Emily, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon from Brussels, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here today to this very distinguished panel and also this very timely webinar, I think. I will focus my intervention on the EU perspective. I can give a glimpse on the German perspective, certainly as well. And I think we can all agree on a lot of points that the previous distinguished speakers have raised. So to let you first briefly know, where do we stand at the WTO discussions? Since there has been a lot of movement in the past 6 weeks, I would say. The EU has very recently in June published its own comprehensive proposal as a response and as an alternative to the South African and Indian initiative for a waiver on IPR. At the last meeting of the WTO TRIPS Council in the beginning of June, it had been decided by WTO members to move closer to text-based negotiations and report to the WTO General Council on the process. And this General Council will take place next week on the 27th, 28th of July. Actually, today, the last formal TRIPS Council is taking place to make a recommendation to the General Council how to move forward. And before that, we had a number of small informal meetings. So far, the participants in these small meetings have discussed the two only proposals that are so far on the table, which is the one on the waiver and the EU alternative that we have now since the month of June. The chair has invited all WTO members to submit more proposals, but so far none have been tabled. So far, no consensus could be reached, and so it's expected that the discussions will continue in the TRIPS Council after the summer break in September. And the aim would be to eventually get a solution for the 12th ministerial conference taking place in Geneva at the end of November. But it is very difficult at this stage to see how a solution could look like. Coming to my second point, what is the EU proposal about that has been submitted to the WTO? First of all, I very much agree with what Honorable Hoback said before. We all share the same goal, which is to vaccinate people all around the world as swiftly as possible, and for that to step up the production. But we differ in how we're getting there. The European Commission, the EU, and also the European People's Party group, for which I am working, we consider that we share a lot of points of views that have been raised before. I will get to this in a few moments. So the EU proposal builds on existing flexibilities that are in the TRIPS agreement to clarify and to streamline the procedures on compulsory licensing, which are very often being perceived as too burdensome and too complex. Since the discussions on the waiver are already very, very difficult and no consensus could be reached until now, the European Commission is of the view that the EU proposal could have a chance to get adopted more swiftly if it gathers enough support. At the same time, this would, of course, enhance also the multilateral framework of the WTO itself. From the EU's point of view, it's also not IPR that is the bottleneck here to ensure equitable access to vaccines, but it is, as previous speakers were saying, the supply of raw materials, the existence of manufacturing capacities, training of personnel, and existing export restrictions also on certain ingredients. On the contrary, it's the IPR protection that has incentivized research and development in the first place and helped to develop a number of vaccines in record time. At the same time, especially mRNA vaccines are very complex to be produced since they involve also a lot of different patents and components. A lifting of the protection of trade secrets would at the same time not automatically grant the access to these trade secrets. It would rather be perceived maybe as a forced technology transfer. But in order to transfer the technology, voluntary licensing and the encouragement of partnerships is the most effective way forward. Let me give you the example of Bangladesh. As a least developed country, it already falls under an existing and very broad waiver under the TRIPS agreement. The reason why Bangladesh is not able to manufacture vaccines itself is the lack of the know-how and technology that would need to be shared, but it is not because the IPR would be an obstacle. To conclude, let me briefly give you a glimpse on the debate in the European Parliament and also from my political group. So in general, in the European Parliament, most political groups are very split on the issue of the TRIPS waiver. Another speaker had raised it before, sometimes ideological reasons. And they are not only split amongst political groups, but sometimes even within one political group, which comes also from national differences in EU member states. In June, so last month, the European Parliament has adopted a resolution on the TRIPS waiver with very tight majorities and now being somewhat contradictory. On the one hand, now it acknowledges the very importance of IPR protection for research and development and for ramping up vaccine manufacturing. On the other hand, it calls for discussions on a limited waiver. So you can see how difficult the discussions here and the majorities in the House are. My political group, the EPP group, nearly unanimously, however, shares the view that I've outlined before. We consider that only an effective framework to protect IPR will incentivize more R&D and also the voluntary sharing of technology and know-how by manufacturers to achieve the common goal that we have to vaccinate everyone. Maybe just one last sentence on the German position. The German position is also very much against a TRIPS waiver, and my personal country has been very vocal about it here, and also in the last political discussions at the last summits that were taking place. So I will stop here, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards. Thanks very much for your attention and again, the invitation.
Thank you, Emily, for your very important insight from the European Union, and the example of Mandl explained very well that the problem is not the IP, but it's something else on the manufacturing side. So we leave the floor to Philip Thompson for what's next in terms of IP protection. Philip, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lorenzo. I just thought all the other presenters did really well, bringing up all the points about intellectual property. I just want to highlight 1 or 2 points before we go to Q&A from my end. I think we usually think of intellectual property as playing a role, especially for patents, in the research and development stage of new drug discovery. It incentivizes large-scale investments into research that usually takes decades to see a drug go all the way from the lab to store shelves and to doctors' prescriptions. I think that part is, most people are aware of that part of the process, and that along the way, it's only actually 10% actually make it all the way to the store shelves because it's a process of science, it's learning, discovery. Not all new medicines, most new medicines don't actually make it through. So patents are important for that process of mitigating risk to make that type of large-scale, long-term investment possible. What's been more clear and coming up during COVID-19 is that patent protections and other forms of intellectual property are also important for the manufacturing part of medicines and getting them into people's arms. And that has played out especially India and South Africa, where firms there, usually producing generics, have been able to secure license agreements with the innovator pharmaceutical companies which allow them to get the recipes and permission and guarantee a form of quality control and producing their vaccines to get them out. And what we've seen is all firms that really have the capacity to do that have been able to find licensing agreements and partners. And this is part of the knowledge sharing and knowledge distribution that intellectual property makes possible. Without these IP rights, these licensing agreements wouldn't be possible. And we would have a sea of, like we see misinformation, we can see lots of counterfeit or substandard vaccines without them. We produced a case study earlier in the year with the launch of the 2020 Intellectual Property Rights Index that looked at who is inventing vaccines, who is doing clinical trials, and where do they rank on the International Property Rights Index. The International Property Rights Index, Lorenzo mentioned, looks at protection of intellectual property rights, but also physical property rights and the legal and political environment responsible for enforcing rights. So we found that the top 20% of countries with the strongest protections of property rights overall, they're home to 73% of the COVID-19 therapies in development. And focusing just on the IP component of the index, the top 15 countries in the highest range of 8.0 to 8.9, those countries are home to 85% of the companies developing COVID-19 therapies. And by far, it's the United States is an outlier here with over 400 therapies, or that's 5% of the world's total are headquartered. Those companies are headquartered in the United States. So I think it's clear that strong intellectual property rights, strong property rights in general, help cultivate that ecosystem between universities, markets, and research to develop new medicines. And the outlier on the lower end, we saw China with a state-controlled economy, very low IP protections, but through that state control, they've been able to produce a little bit more than others. But all the other top 15 countries producing COVID-19 vaccines and other therapies, it's led by the private sector by strong intellectual property rights. Thank you, Lorenzo, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Philip, for summarizing the debate. This has been extremely important, interesting to listen to the different from our friend from a different country, the position on IP. Now we move into the Q&A. We have a question for a member of the Canadian Parliament, Hoback. what the Conservative Party in Canada is doing with legislation to protect.
Well, there is existing legislation to protect intellectual property here in Canada already, so that's in place. As far as new legislation, we're in the process right now of our summer recess and speculation of an oncoming fall election. So at this point, there's nothing in the process of anything until if this speculated election should happen. So one thing about the Canadian parliamentary system, once you go into election mode, everything that's on the order paper drops off the order paper, and you start anew or fresh with a new speech from the throne and move forward. So at this point in time, there isn't much.
Thank you so much. We have a question also for Geanluca Lorenzon from Mauricio Bento. Brazil has been in path of reform. What are the next steps to increase innovation and build a stronger economy in Brazil?
So we have a goal to be the top 3 most friendly environment for startups. And we also have a goal to be on the top 50 of the ease of doing business by the World Bank, which will hopefully reflect on other rankings and so on. And we also have a goal to improve significantly in the intellectual property rights index. So right now, just to answer this, there's not like an easy action that's going to solve all the problems. We have a huge pipeline for all those initiatives, but we are 100% committed to both improving those international standards and rankings, and also to Lorenzo to make sure that Brazil is more integrated with the rest of the world. As you may know, Brazil is the closest economy on the G20, and that has to change. Brazil is trying to change. We are fighting Argentina right now in order to lower our tariffs because we're part of Mercosur. This let's say a small version of the European Union. So we are looking forward to integrate with the world while respecting intellectual property rights and to ensure that Brazil is a serious country for commerce, investments, and so on.
Thank you, Geanluca. And I know we have a question also from Philip for everyone. Philip, feel free to ask your question.
Thanks, Lorenzo. I thought it was very interesting and comforting to hear from all the speakers that intellectual property rights are not the barrier that people say they are, and that what is really needed, the real problem is to increase vaccine manufacturing capacity. And even Emily, I think I heard you say that increasing intellectual property rights would actually aid in that effort to upgrade manufacturing capacity. But there seems to be an insistence on intellectual property. The waiver has the support of 130 countries. I'm wondering if you or Randy or Geanluca, as Brazil's experience, how do you respond to the insistence just on waiving intellectual property and instead focus on a market approach to production?
I'm going to be very honest with you, Philip. It's very hard. It's very hard because, especially from let's say from the Congress point of view, they are delivering something for their constituents. If they simply approve an act of law which says, it's waived after now unilaterally, and not even from the World Trade Organization. So we are working as a government. The government has been against any such proposals in Congress. Some of them are moving. It's very hard to bring the free market message. And part of this happens because most of those international companies, they made contracts not with healthcare providers, not with companies or corporations. They made deals with governments. So whether we like it or not, like both Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca and Janssen, all of them have chosen to prioritize making contracts with government for government distribution. So that made the argument of a free market solution much, much harder. But anyway, we're trying to show how important it is to what the main strategy here, just to answer your question, Philip, is we're focusing on how harmful will be to waive unilaterally those kind of property rights, because otherwise we may even suffer some sort of retaliation for receiving vaccines for instance, from first world countries like you mentioned. So this has been our focus right now, and working showing that the main issue here is the lack of the active ingredients and not the intellectual property rights.
Anyone else want to answer? Otherwise,
yeah, one thing I think is really disingenuous in a lot of countries is they look at it and say, "Wow, consensus of the WTO, chances are small." Politically, the media is putting a lot of pressure on them to sign on to this. They're getting emails from the left to this, so they just, let's just get it off our table and move on. But the message it sends is a really bad message, and it sends a message of disincentives for the private sector to research into new types of drugs or technology. And that's the concern I have with that type of message, of where they just shrug their shoulders and say, well, let's just get it off our table so I don't have to answer the media questions today in the Scrum on trips. What I find really frustrating is a lot of people don't educate themselves on exactly what this means. And a lot of people haven't spent the time, and maybe the industry hasn't done a proper job explaining to people what the real barriers are. When we started holding the committee meetings on it, it became very clear what the barriers were. It wasn't TRIPS. It was production, it was supply of ingredients, it was trade restrictions from some countries. If you actually talk to the companies, there was a lot of intellectual sharing between the three big drug makers plus other companies in not only the discovery of the vaccination, but in the manufacturing and the production. So there's a lot of shared ideas and technologies already going on in the background in a market environment. So it can happen. And what I find really frustrating, and you heard it again today, you can easily say, well, we're dealing with this at the WTO politically. But we all know the WTO is a very slow mechanism. In the meantime, we need to get people vaccinated. And that's why I always say the goal here is to get people vaccinated. How we get A to Z really doesn't matter to me. It's to get to Z. And the fastest way to get there right now is a market-driven solution, not a government-driven one. So, if you really want to accomplish that goal, that's where we should focus our efforts.
Thank you. Emily, you want to say something?
Yes, maybe just to complement from my point of view, working here in the European Parliament, having seen the debate, I think it's a very emotional debate in the media, in the Parliament, and it's very difficult to reply to that, since also this whole TRIPS waiver discussion, it's very complex, highly technical, so there is a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding around that, and of course then it's emotionally maybe easier to be in favor of a TRIPS waiver. So I think what we're at least trying to do, my members of parliament, is to explain the public, making press statements and press articles. What I would be maybe on my own interested in, maybe from Philip's side, since the USTR has made that statement to support such discussions on a limited waiver. According to my information, the United States have been very silent in the past WTO discussions. So I would be very interested in hearing your views. Where does the United States stand right now? Do you think there will be any development, any proposal, or what is your view?
Yeah, I think we should be really concerned that the United States might make its own proposal about what it sees as something that's negotiable. And that would be really worrisome, because it would set kind of a new norm for discussing vaccines, when for the past several decades, the United States has been spearheading strong intellectual property protections. But then we've already had 2 proposals from India and South Africa that didn't approach where the United States said it would start. And so we'll have a back and forth until at least November at the WTO ministerial. And then after that, if they do agree on something, the best estimates are that for the firms not producing these vaccines yet, because they don't have licensing agreements, because they just don't have the capacity to make them, it would take at least a year or more for those firms to upgrade their materials, their plants, to be producing these vaccines that they're not producing yet. So like Andy was saying, we really want to get to Z and Canadian, but even in the best case scenario with the waiver, that's at least a year or two. And I also wanted to point out, we were talking about the dangers of the waiver. The same country, India, known for having the most production of generic medicines, is also known for producing the most counterfeit medicines. And I think there's another danger about what that might mean. They've already had a big scandal with hydrochloroquine, with many people buying a counterfeit hydrochloroquine that was basically water. And so people thought they were getting protection. They thought they were getting help to combat COVID-19, and they weren't getting anything. And there's a fear that if we do have a waiver, then it will be impossible to enforce real intellectual property rights that offer as a quality control on things like that.
Phil, in fact, on this quality control, we have a question regarding that, because from Georgina Agostini from the public, will the vaccine waiver likely increase the illicit trade of phony and unauthorized vaccine or other medical material? How should we respond to this? This is a question for Representative Hoback.
I don't know how to answer that. It may or may not. I'm not an expert in that area in what will happen there. Whether you have a waiver or not, I think you're going to see people that just do bad things that'll try to sell something that isn't what it is. The more concern I have is if you put a waiver and you put a facility in there and it's accredited supposedly, and it isn't producing the vaccine in an appropriate fashion, and it's not effective or not efficient, and it doesn't work, that has more to undermine people getting vaccinated than anything else. So, whether the TRIPS waiver, if it should go forward and move forward, if it doesn't have a quality assurance program tied to it to ensure that that vaccine is being produced in that facility is actual what it is said to be, you can undermine the whole regime on whether or not you should be vaccinated or not if you get the wrong type of product going out under an official banner.
Thank you, Randy. Emily, do you have anything on this question on illicit trade?
On illicit trade, well, I also don't have a
counterfeit product from the IP.
Yes. Well, I think the consequences can be very far-reaching, and it can be absolutely counterproductive, since the IPR framework has been built up for years. And if you take away the platform on which R&D and then sharing of technology happens, then companies will simply be disincentivized. And also, as I was saying in my intervention, if you lift the protection to get the trade secret is not secret anymore, but it doesn't give you any access directly to the trade secret and to the technology. So it's, there is another barrier if you want to speak of barriers. So and the companies will simply say, well, then we don't produce anything anymore if our trade secret is lifted. So in the end, you would, this is also what I said, end up with a rather forced technology transfer, so to say, if you don't protect trade secrets properly.
Thank you, Emily. We are running out of time. I really want to thank all of you. A great presentation. Representative Hoback, outstanding presentation, providing insight from Canada. Emily, Senator Barrasso, Geanluca, Lorenzon, Philip Thompson. I mean, we can definitely conclude that intellectual property rights of innovators are not a barrier to the rapid acceleration of COVID-19 production the world needs. Removing the IP right would make it more difficult for innovators to share the technology and know-how needed for manufacturers to produce genuine. Say that there is a world IP crisis. Only 15 countries enable the robust property right protection are responsible of 85% of the COVID-19 therapy in development. Leveling up IP protection will allow more countries to participate in breakthrough innovation. So thank you so much again for your participation, for your leadership in this very important topic that affect our life, our health, and of course, the innovation for new medicine. Thank you again, and looking forward to see all of you in the next Property Right Alliance policy webinar. Thank you, have a great day.